Hi, I'm Hannah, the creator of House of Brick Designs. I'm here with another tutorial, this time for the Ida walking skirt. So be forewarned, this tutorial is a little bit long. However, this skirt does have some tricky spots, and I think it will be really helpful to show my process. You'll also get to watch me make a really big mistake, and how I go about fixing it. We all make sewing mistakes from time to time, and I think it's good to learn that everything has a solution. This tutorial is a step-by-step reflection of the pattern instructions. So if you just need to see what I did on a certain step, you can refer to the timestamps in the description below. If you love historical clothes as much as I do, I hope that this video will help you create a garment that you love to wear and feel beautiful in. Okay, so here I am laying out the pattern pieces that I already cut out off camera because honestly, who wants to watch that? These are really big pattern pieces anyway, so it would be really hard to film cutting them all out. I'm sure you don't want to see me like scrambling around on my living room floor for that. Yeah, pieces. You cut them out. It's cool. And adding hem stiffening. So in my instructions I actually mentioned this is something you can do in the last step, but I'm doing it here so that I can serge this piece of fabric into the skirt piece as one, and actually that's going to help stabilize it and secure it in place and just being less stitching for me. I'm using just a plain muslin here, but if you wanted to invest in something like tarlatan, that would actually be the period appropriate fabric. And we're serging the edges. As you can see, here's the piece that I was just pinning that in. I've stitched it in and now I'm just serging it in along the edge. So it's just like that little added security to hold it in place. And transferring the stitch line of the facings is an important step, I feel. It'll make the process of adding the tab facings to the skirt back and bottom edge a lot easier if you have these stitch lines marked out on the wrong side of the fabric. It'll make your life easier because these corners are a little bit tricky. So in here you can see on the wrong side, those edges are nicely marked. The straight sections of the tab are 1/2 inch from that serged edge you can see here, and then the curved section is 1/2 inch from that cut edge of the facing. Alright, here we are on step 1, which is sewing on the facings. You can see now why having the stitch line marked for the tab is going to make your life a lot easier as you sew the tabs. And so I'm pinning them along the edge and then stitching using that straight edge to follow where I need to stitch, because, I mean, it'd be easy to follow the curve, I suppose, but when you get down into the corners, it gets a little tight and it can be a little confusing. So having it marked out as you are working on this just makes your life easier and makes the whole sewing process a lot smoother. Here I'm marking 1/2 inch from the bottom edge of this tab because I want that to be my stopping point, and I want it to be really clear to myself. This will be important in later processes, that you stop right at that point and not continue stitching. And here I'm about to trim down the seam allowance. I'm grading these curves because I can't do understitching in these sections. That would just be too difficult. So instead I'm grading down the excess of the seam allowance, and then I'm going to clip in to make turning these out a lot easier. Clipping in here into the corners, making sure not to clip through the stitch line. So clip up to but not through, so that turning these corners right side out will be a lot easier, and then clipping away the excess. Okay, here you can see I've highlighted the curve of the bottom tab so that it'll be easier for you to see. And then I'm showing you where you want this lower tab to line up. The longer point points towards the seam allowance, and getting that correct will make your life easier. And I did not actually transfer the marks in the same way on this lower tab facing as I did on the upper side tab facings, but because it's just one little round like this, I felt like as long as I had the corners nicely marked, it would be fine. So I just marked those with my blue disappearing ink pen, and that's just enough for me to make sure I hit those corners nice and firmly and make nice crisp pivots so that I end up with a nicely finished tab. So pivoting and continuing along with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this outer curved edge. It's a little bit tight, but it is manageable, and if marking out the entire seam allowance makes this process easier for you, by all means do so. There's nothing stopping you from having a stitch line marked out. And then on this edge of the tab that goes up to the seam, I just sew right along to the edge. It's just this edge here that points towards the inside of the skirt, in towards the inner fabric. One edge, really needs to be stopped 1/2 inch from the edge, and the side that goes into another seam, that is not as necessary. I'm grading this down in the same way as the upper tabs were, and clipping into the seam allowance to make turning this curved shape so much easier. And pressing, because pressing and turning your edges really does make for a nicer finish. Flip that right side out, kind of fiddle it into the right shape, and then press everything nice and flat. And using a tool, this is actually a point turner, but I felt like the opposite round edge would actually help me get a nicer round turned edge for this little tab. And doing the same process with the upper tabs. They've all been trimmed down, graded down and trimmed up with little V's cut out to make the turning process easier. And so that they will look really nice when they're right side out. Fiddly business, and using that wrong side of the point turner to get these pushed out nicely really does help. But yeah, solid press, and these things are looking a lot better. Okay, so we're on step 2. This is first the section with the tab that's on the upper side skirt section. I'm just attaching that to the lower side skirt section, which is that half circle shape. And I'm being careful to only pin through the tab facing to the lower skirt section. I'm also going to make sure to start my stitching exactly where the tab facing stitching started, over here on the inner edge. And as I stitch along, I want to stitch close to this previous stitch line and fold line, but not through it. I want to make sure that I don't catch any of the upper side skirt in this section of the seam, because that will result in an invisible finish from the outside. So you can see this tab still loose. That's important, that's seam allowance. And this tab is like a little pocket in there. So here's the underneath the tab, and then from the top of the tab, without any stitching going through it, it just looks so nice and clean. So we're going to continue the seam along here, pushing this tab out of the way because I don't want to catch that in my stitching and risk having that peeking through the seam line actually. So I'm just going to fold that seam allowance out of the way and secure it, and then fold up the rest of the seam allowance. So the section that is facing the camera is the upper skirt section, and below it is the lower half circle shape of the lower skirt. And so stitching along the seam and just making sure to stop right at the point where the stitching began on the tab, so that that seam is just really looks continuous from the outside of the garment. Showing where my stitch line stopped, making sure that tab is free and clear of the seam. And then from the outside, the whole thing is just one continuous seam. And the tab is just like magically floating there. So it's important to press all of these items open and press as you go. Makes for a nicer finish. And then one thing I should mention is I didn't do any of the stay stitching included in the instructions what I did instead was I relied on my serging of all the edges to basically be that stay stitching. But yeah, nice little press, and doesn't that look good? Alright, once you have completed the side skirt assembly, then stitching this side front seam together is a real breeze. Just make sure that the seam allowance that comes butting into your side front seam is pressed open, and in fact I pinned it open so that I wouldn't accidentally have one fold closed as I was stitching it. And I went ahead and did that on both sides, because on the other side, what you're seeing is not the side skirt, but the front skirt. And I wanted to make sure that nothing got stitched the wrong direction as I was assembling it. It just keeps the seam looking nice on the outside. And here I am reducing those seam allowances, cutting away the extra so that when I press open this seam, the whole thing will just lay that much nicer. It's nice not to have this extra bulk right at this point. And pressing, which will make pressing this seam open that much nicer and easier. Makes for a really nice clean finish and less bulky. Looks better on the outside is the whole point, really. Okay, so what I'm doing here in step 5 is measuring half of the back skirt panel and then subtracting 6 inches from that in order to get my skirt amount. Oh look, I just did my math wrong. I'll figure it out several steps down the line. But what I've done here is I've pulled out a bit of twill tape. I wish it was a little narrower, but I was trying to use what I had, and I'm cutting off a piece that is what I think will be the right size for my finished back skirt panel, and I'm going to attach this skirt panel to this twill tape. This is not necessary, it's just something that I thought would make this process easier. It didn't. I ended up screwing it up, but you know, live and learn. So here I am gathering this waistline of the skirt panel using my longest stitches, and I'm going to do a second row of stitching along here that I can pull these together and gather up my skirt with. And then once all those stitches are in place, I pinned the center back, which is in the seam line essentially, pinned that to the center of this twill tape, and then pinned the ends of the skirt to the end of the twill tape, or the mark that I made that is supposed to be what my skirt gathers down to, and then I'm gathering between those two. Later on I find out that I did not gather this down enough, and that was me messing up my math, and I take this all out. But this is a technique you can use if you want to gather something down to a certain size and have it be really solidly secured in place. Alright, so here we are assembling the placket. Off camera I have already interlined one side of the placket, and this is just stitching around the curved edge of the two plackets, putting them right sides together. And then clipping the corner in this upper section, and clipping away little notches out of the seam allowance so this curve will turn nicely when we turn it right side out. So just around that curve, the whole thing doesn't need to be clipped. Here you can see the side that I flatlined, interlined, and then flipping this right side out and pressing it. Using a little point turner to get this corner nice and neat. Here we go, pressing it so that the whole thing is nice and flat. The curves can be tricky. Those parts can sometimes not get pressed out all the way the first time around, so you gotta make sure that everything is thoroughly turned. Alright, so attaching that placket involves making sure that you don't pin it too close to the seam allowance. So I've actually measured 1/2 inch down, and now I'm pinning the placket down the rest of the way, pinning through all layers, and then stitching it down in place at 1/2 inch from the edge. And I do stitch this right to the edge of the placket itself. And then I make sure to press open that seam or really just press over the seam allowance so everything is pointing inwards towards the inside of the garment. Okay, so here we're lining up the lower seam from the side skirt panel to the inner facing that I added to just the lower hem portion of both the front and back skirts. So I made sure that those would line up when I was placing that inner facing, and then pinning the rest of the seam along here. But making sure to fold away the seam allowance of the upper tab facing so that I don't catch it in the seam and inadvertently have it showing, peeking out on the outside. And now you can see stitching that side seam, I want to start exactly at the point where the facing stitching ends, which is part of why I was folding that seam allowance back out of the way and using that first pin to kind of be an indicator of where I want to start my stitching. So I actually backed into it a little bit there. And then I'm continuing along just at 1/2 inch seam allowance for the whole seam. And being careful to go over the seam that is connecting the upper and lower sections of the side skirt so that I don't accidentally fold over one of those seam allowances and create a bulky spot right there. And here's what the facing should look like when you have sewn it correctly, so nothing's stuck together. So now what I'm doing is sewing just the upper facing on the wearer's left side. Just the upper facing of that side back seam being sewn to the back skirt panel, and being careful to ease that a little bit. These pieces were, of course, the same size, but because one is on the bias a little bit, a little bit of easing sometimes has to happen. And then stitching carefully along that fold, catching these are actually little bits of the facing seam allowance that are just showing a little bit on this side from where I clipped and stuff, but being careful to stitch as close to this folded edge as possible without stitching through, because I don't want to catch my stitching through the tabs, at least not visually on the outside. So really I'm just stitching the facing seam allowance there, and then going ahead and pressing everything open. This is the side seam below the wearer's right side back facing and placket area, so it's just the side seam in that section. And then here is the section with the facing sewn into the seam so that the tabs are basically floating on the outside as a decorative element, and then pressing that facing and tab section open so that everything lays really nicely and looks really clean on the outside. And here you can see it on the outside, really nice and flat, but a good press is always a good finish. Alright, here you can see what I'm trying to do is line up the side back placket opening. This is on the wearer's right back area. Basically pinning those together at the top of the skirt seam, lining up both the placket seam and the flat edge section of the tabs, because those are supposed to be aligned when this is closed in the final garment. So with those lined up, then I can basically make sure that my reinforcement is not going to cause any strange pulling lines or anything like that. And really this is put in place to make sure that you don't rip out the seam below the placket. It is a weak point on the garment, and a little bit of reinforcement stitching will help ensure that this garment has some longevity for you in the future. Okay, so here we are with the skirt lining that I've assembled off camera. This is a bit of iridescent crossweave taffeta that had some wonky stains on it that I decided meant that it was not good to be an outside fabric shown on the outside of a garment, so that's why it became this lining. So what you see here is I've got the lining assembled right side out, and the actual skirt is inside out, so that those seam allowances for both can be sandwiched between the two, ensuring that those seam allowances don't catch on anything and protect each other. The whole point of the lining is to protect the inside of the garment. And you can see here now I'm pinning along the stitch line of the placket, pinning the folded edge of this lining opening. And on the other side of this placket opening, I'm doing the same thing, just lining up the edge of the lining just to the inside of the folded straight edge on these tabs to cleanly finish off this placket opening. And then along this waistline, I'm lining up the seams because this lining pattern is exactly the same as the skirt pattern, just without the details of the tabs and such. I was able to just line up those seams, and as you can see here, this front waistline has bagged out just a little bit because it was constructed first. It had a chance to stretch a bit, so I'm just going to ease that in because I know the lining is really stable and secure. This is a good reason to add your stay stitching to the waistline. And then lining up the center back seam on both the lining and the outer skirt, and just trying to get those gathers to be evenly distributed so that they are basically gathered the same amount. I'm pinning that in place in preparation to stay stitch or baste these two pieces together just along the waistline. Okay, so now that I've got the placket opening pinned all nice and neat, I went ahead and hand stitched the lining into place, being careful to use a small slip stitch, although pretty quickly that evolved into a felling stitch. And you can see the whole point of hand stitching this is to make sure that the outside of these tabs remains clear of any visible stitching, which is easier to do with hand sewing along a section like this. In theory, you could get inside of the skirt between the lining and the outer garment and just stitch these together along the seam allowance, but I do think that runs the risk of having something not turn out quite as nicely. And I also really like hand sewing, so doing a little bit of it back here just made the prospect of this finishing process that much more appealing. And for a small section, this kind of thing goes really fast. Here you can see a nice close-up of what I'm talking about, just lining up the folded edge of this lining right along the stitch line that attaches the placket to the skirt. It makes for a really nice, invisible, delicate finish, and I'm just doing a felling stitch by this point because it's faster and it looks almost as good as a slip stitch. But I do think a felling stitch is a little bit stronger, so it's probably the better option for this area. And then I decided to do some hand basting to get the gathered section of the back skirt to play nicely together before I basted the rest of the waistline together. I definitely want to baste this whole waistline before I attach the waistband to the skirt. And here I'm at the machine baste stitching the waistband together. Certainly on the flat sections of the skirt I don't have to worry as much, but I do want to make sure that there's less room for things to slip or move around, and then going along and actually machine basting that back gathered section together as well, just to keep everything really corralled down and submit to my will. Because springy fabrics like the lining can really bite you. Alright, right now is the time to prepare the waistband. So off camera I've flatlined one side with this thicker linen, almost canvasy quality, and what I'm doing right now is I'm transferring the marks from the outer side of the waistband to the inside where they're going to be much more helpful to have. And then pinning the waistband right sides together, marking the center point that the two waistbands should line up so that I don't accidentally stretch or gather anything. And then pinning along, moving towards that center point. Which, because the back closure is not actually centered, technically this center point on the waistband is not center front. And then stitching starting at this bottom mark and then working my way around to the top side of the waistband. In retrospect, I'm not sure that this is the best way to go about constructing this garment. It is a lot easier to turn it without that enclosed two-corner edge. I think you might get a better result actually if you just started with the back vertical ends, do that little section, and then leave this bottom section open. But just stitching along at my 1/2 inch mark, you can see the basting is at about 1/4 inch, or the flatline stitching that holds this flatlining in place. Here we are clipping off the corners and grading down the seams. And grading down that long top edge of the waistband. First by completely clipping off as much of the interlining as possible and then clipping down the seam allowance. This is the piece that interlining is attached to. That's getting clipped down halfway, so that there's a bit of a stair-step effect on the seam allowances, so that it's not quite as bulky. And clipping corners. So once I have this flipped right side out, I go ahead and understitch. I find that understitching really makes a huge difference in the final finish of your garment, so I do it in as many places as I can get away with it to force the seam to roll the direction that I want it to. So what you can see is the seam allowances have all been pushed upwards, and I'm stitching just to the right of the original seam that is holding all the pieces together. So it's a scant 1/16 of an inch. You try to get as close to that original stitch line and the folded edge as you can. And then once the understitching is done, I'm clipping into the seam allowance where there's a slightly curved section. This is definitely more pronounced on the ends of the waistband and not as much in the center area. So I do give a couple of clips, but they're much more spaced out in the center because it's just not as necessary. Basically, the tighter your curve, the more and closer you want your clips to be to allow the curved edge of the fabric to flex in the direction that it is supposed to. And then once that is clipped, pressing the seam down to really reinforce that understitching that you've just done. Help the seam to lay as nicely as possible and to finish that edge. Really to ensure that the inner waistband edge doesn't peek out up from the seam. That's the whole point of the understitching and the grading, and then this pressing to ensure everything stays where you just put it. And then now I'm pressing up what will be the inner waistband, pressing that seam allowance up to make it easier for me to stitch that into place in a later step. And pinning the outer waistband to the skirt waistline. And as I'm pinning along the flat sections till I get to the gathered section, this is when I discovered I'd screwed up big time on how much I needed to gather. So here is the whole process of rectifying the mistake I had just discovered I'd made. I mean, it's relatively easy. I just needed the gathering to tighten up so that it fit into the space that was left in the waistband. But unfortunately, I had done all this stitching to lock the gathering down and make sure that it was not going to move on me. So I had to undo all of that. All this basting first to separate the lining from the outer skirt. And then once that was separated, I had to remove that twill tape because it was keeping the outer skirt from being able to move. It was basically locking my gathering in place on that section. So really, at this point, I was just like, this is extra bulk, and I just need to get the whole thing out. So that's what I did. And so, fortunately, I still had the original gathering stitches left in place. I just had to tighten those up a bit, so I was able to use those in my quest to get the skirt to actually fit into the waistband. And then, once everything was retightened, I pinned it to the waistband, marking my center of where the back seam needed to land. That's what that pin was for. And so I lined up the center back of the outer skirt, and then pull up the center back of the lining. Well, once I get all the gathers pinned in place on the outer skirt, then I would pull up the center back of the lining and line it up with that same pin. So the lining needed to be tightened up as well because it was too loose. And then those center back seams can line up and get pinned into the same location. And then once I had the rest of the lining pinned in, I went ahead and basted this section of the skirt to the waistband because now it was really wibbly and bulky, and I really wanted to make sure that as I sewed this portion of the skirt down, I wanted to have all the gathers corralled in place and less likely to shift around on me and perhaps pop up into the seam in a weird way or have a bit of seam allowance hanging out. Gathers are unruly. You just kind of have to show them who's boss. Now I was able to finally stitch the waistband onto the skirt. So the waistband is actually under what you're seeing here. I actually am sewing the gathered section of the skirt first so that I can really see what it wants to do, where it wants to go, and stop that if it's going somewhere I don't want it. So this part is very fiddly. Once we get to the flatter section of the skirt, the whole thing goes much more smoothly. And here's the flat section of the skirt. As you can see, just zipping along compared to dealing with those gathers. Alright, so now that I've finally got the waistband in place, I can go ahead and pin it closed using that fold that I had pinned in place to get that fold just past the stitch line that stitched the front of the waistband onto the skirt. So I know I want to get it past that stitch line because I want to be able to do a stitch in the ditch finish to nail this waistband into place. So once again, gathers are always fiddly, so I was fiddling those, pushing them up into place and making sure nothing was sticking out, and then basting the waistband closed, stitching from the outside so that I can make sure my stitches are disappearing into that outer seam line, and feeling on the back that they are still catching that inner waistband. These are going to be really big stitches because I'm just trying to make sure that everything is locked down into position before I use the machine stitching to really sew it in place. So you can see here where those stitches were landing, and then as I was hand sewing, I discovered that this is where I really should have left that waistband bottom edge open, because I just ended up having to slip stitch these two pieces together, and if I had not finished the top of the placket edge here and not finished the bottom edge of the waistband, I could have just stuck that placket right into the waistband if I'd just been thinking about it. But I did not, and this is actually how the instructions go, so if you want to do this step, here I'm demonstrating it, but you now know that this is something that you could skip and simplify. And here I am once more just slip stitching the outside now to make sure that that outer face of this placket is nicely finished, and I've got a little bit here that I just need to stitch down because it just needs to be locked in place. So here I'm finishing all the hand stitching with a little stitch in place knot, and then burring my thread so that I don't cut it right next to the knot, helping ensure that that knot stays tied. It's less likely to get unwound. And then finally, stitching in the ditch from the outside, making sure my needle is landing right along that seam line, and this is going to lock down the inner waistband and really give it a nice sturdy finish line that will be invisible from the outside because it's disappeared in the seam. And here, stitching along these gathers, I'm just making sure that nothing gets pulled out of place. I'm really kind of pulling down towards the left on those gathers and making sure that nothing gets caught and looks bad in the finished product. Alright, here we are putting in the closures for this skirt. So I'm starting with the back inner waistband snap placement. This will not necessarily take too much strain on the waistband, but just help keep the waistband lined up properly so that you don't get any of it sticking out at the top of your skirt looking too weird. But I've gone ahead and, using a pin, marked the placement that the snaps need to land. And because I marked them at the same time, I know that these will line up. And with small snaps like these, I usually do about 3 to 5 stitches per hole as I work my way around the snap. There's not really a set rule, it's just a matter of what looks good, what fills in the hole. And here I am putting on the corresponding male side of the snap. I always try to put the female side closer to the body and the male side on top of that. So I started by tying a knot in the end of my thread and then sending the needle between the inner waistband and the lining, and then poking that needle out in the waistband about where I wanted to start sewing my snap. As you can see here, closer up, it's just a few stitches per hole, and I'm working my way around the snap, trying to radiate the stitches so they don't end up landing on top of each other, but sort of sitting right next to each other until I fill in the hole. It's kind of like a little sunburst of stitches coming out of each snap hole. Alright, once the snap is in place, I can sew the hook on. This will actually take the brunt of the heavy lifting for the skirt closure. But that's what hooks are good for. And I'm sewing this by starting my knot underneath where the hook will land, so it actually protects that first knot a bit, and stitching around the hook, doing a lot more stitches per hole on the hook just because there's more room per hole. So it's probably about 5 to 10 stitches in each hole. But as you can see, it still creates this little sunburst of stitching as you lay each stitch next to the last one. Alright, once the hook is in place and you close up the snaps, you can use that to line up where the bar needs to land so that everything is nice and flush. And I'm using this pin here to indicate where the end of the hook landed, so I know that I want to put my bar right next to that hook. And then starting the thread on the inside, once again sending it between the waistband and the lining, and then pushing it out through to the outside of the waistband, approximately where I want to start stitching on this hook. And then I'm leaving the pin in place because that actually helped me push the bar into place as I was stitching along on the first half, but later on I took it out because it was starting to get in the way. And then sewing the buttons onto all the tabs. Here, this is actually a non-functional tab. This won't open, so I'm stitching this button through all layers so that it's stitched down to the skirt through the tab, and then wrapping the button with the end of the thread to actually help force the button to sit in a very upright, non-droopy position. So I'm wrapping about 10 times here, and this is really just going to force that button to stand upright. And then I'm sewing the hooks on the underside of the tabs on the placket opening. And I'm lining up these hooks with the lining edge centered on each tab. And here I've doubled my thread so that stitching these bars goes just a little bit faster. Finishing the hook off with a little knot behind where it will probably not get rubbed too much. And then once I have those hooks in place, I can use these pins that you see here to line up with each hook and indicate where I needed the bars to land. And those bars are also lined up directly on top of the seam that attaches the placket piece to the skirt back, which is part of why I made sure that the hooks also lined up with this lining, because I know that those two seams land directly on top of each other. And then I decided to add these snaps underneath the button tabs just to help keep those button tabs from being weighted down and drooping under the weight of the buttons sitting on them because they were not secured all the way through the skirt. And with all the functional closures sewn, I can hook up all the hooks properly and line up the snaps to indicate where the corresponding female end of the snap needs to land. And just stitching it through all the layers. In the process, I decided to double check that the snaps actually lined up properly and things still looked nice and neat, and that was the case here, so I just continued stitching. So once all these snaps and all these hooks and bars are all sewn on, you can close this up and get a nice finished product. Ideally, the whole thing should look invisible, just the same as the side that doesn't have any closures. It's the goal anyway. So yeah, look how nice that is. It's very smooth and cleanly finished looking, which is the point. Okay, we're in the home stretch now. Here I am demonstrating a blind hem stitch to hem up my skirt. Unfortunately, I didn't get any footage of marking the hemline, but basically I had to have a friend help me out with that, and I just had her mark where the skirt was hitting the floor while I was barefoot, and then I turned it up an inch from that point to get this to like a nice walking skirt length. But here you can see I'm just taking a tiny prick stitch into the folded up hem edge just past the serging, and then a corresponding tiny stitch trying to just go through the flat lining of the skirt above the hem. And just trying to keep this not too tight a tension, even little stitches, and as I go around you'll be able to see from the outside this becomes just an invisible hem, which is really the goal. There are machine stitches that somewhat mimic a blind hem like this, but they don't look nearly as nice as this.
I hope this walk through the construction process has been helpful to you. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. And you can click the bell icon to be notified the next time I upload.